It's time for the UNX News. Extraterrestrials, time anomalies, dimensions, remote viewing, UFOs, UAPs, and USOs, ghostly encounters, abductions, Bigfoot, and more. Your end of the week news source for everything unexplained. Here is your host for the UNX News Podcast, Margie K.
Good evening and welcome to UNX News. I'm your host, Margie K. We're here every Friday at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm glad you could join me this evening because I have a very special guest. But first, I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, XCon this last weekend went very well. It was fantastic. All the speakers were excellent. We had some really nice vendors, and a lot of people really helped out. We had some nice volunteers that helped us pull this off, and the staff. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for helping make this a really good event. Next year, our conference is going to be held October 11th through the 13th in Springfield, Missouri. So mark your calendar now and don't schedule anything over that time because you're going to want to be there. Next, I want to mention that in April next year, there's going to be a solar eclipse. And at the same time in Piedmont, Missouri and Mountain Home, Missouri, they are having their UFO festivals. So also mark your calendar for that. I think it's the first weekend in April. And this book, the 50th anniversary of the Southeast Missouri Ozarks UFO Flap, which was written by Debbie Ziegelmeyer and myself, is about that area in Southeast Missouri when the big, huge UFO flap happened in 1973. But things are ongoing, and they have been ever since till today. So I think you'll find that book interesting. It's available at Amazon. My guest this evening is Marc Hartzman. He's been called one of America's leading connoisseurs of the bizarre. And George Norrie from Coast to Coast AM said he's as bizarre as Robert Ripley. Hartzman considers both high compliments since his passion for the unusual started with Ripley's Believe It or Not and the annual Guinness World Records books during his youth. In addition to his books about ghosts, Mars, Oliver Cromwell's embalmed head, weird things on eBay, sideshow performers, and unorthodox messages from God, Hartzman has written for Mental Floss, The Huffington Post, AOL Weird News, AllThingsInteresting.com, The Morbid Anatomy Online Journal, and Bizarre Magazine. He's discussed oddities on CNN, MSNBC, Ripley's Radio, and the Travel Channel's Mysteries at the Museum. More of his love for the unusual can be found on his site, weirdhistorian.com. Outside of these projects, Hartzman earns a living as an award-winning advertising creative director. Welcome to the program, Marc.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Margie. Good to be here.
Thank you for joining me this evening, and thank you for sending your book to me, which is fantastic. I love the layout. It's a hardback. It's super nice just to look at, not counting the reading part, which is very interesting. And you have kind of a quirky style, I would say, writing style, a little bit humorous, which is nice, and to keep it nice and light because these subjects about UFOs can sometimes get too serious, I think. So I've got to ask you first, what got you interested in weird things in general?
Well, a little bit like what you said in the intro. Ever since I was a kid, I loved reading Ripley's Believe It or Not, watching the show on TV, the Guinness Book of World Records back when they were those like thick, small black and white books. Mm-hmm. And I was especially always interested by the world's tallest man ever, Robert Wadlow, who was 8 feet and 11.5 inches tall.
Wow.
And I was fascinated by him. Every year you get some new photos and some new information on him. So I'd always look forward to that. I saw The Elephant Man, David Lynch's The Elephant Man, very early, around 7 or 8 years old, and that stuck in my head quite a bit. And then I had the Mysteries of the Unknown books from Time Life, the UFO book, which I still have on my shelf back here. So I've always liked these bizarre things, and I've just enjoyed writing about all these sort of stranger pages of history.
Now, I read in your book that you have not ever had a UFO sighting yourself. So, what is it about the UFO subject? Why did you write a book about that?
Yeah, I wish I could say I had one, but I haven't. Um, Again, it's just a topic I find fascinating, and I started writing about it a little bit in my book called The Big Book of Mars, which came out in July of 2020.
Mhm.
And in that book, I talked all about it covers a lot about Mars, and a lot of that's about early belief in intelligent life on Mars. And I found that to be really fascinating that in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there was a lot of belief from major scientific thinkers, people like Nikola Tesla, Guglielmo Marconi, William Henry Pickering at Harvard. So a lot of these really brilliant minds truly believed in intelligent life on Mars. They were trying to find ways we could reach them or contact them or receive their messages. So
Mhm.
that I found fascinating. And as I continued in the book, once I got into the UFO era, late 1940s and early 50s, a lot of beliefs were that those UFOs people were seeing were piloted by Martians. There was still that belief in intelligent Martians at that time. So
Mhm.
I covered it to a certain degree in the Big Book of Mars, but obviously there's so much more, so many more stories to tell that I really just wanted to dive into a lot deeper. And that's where the new book comes in. We Are Not Alone.
I noticed in the book that there were some pretty strange ideas about contacting these people from Mars from Earth. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there were some really amazing ideas. Again, this was the early 1900s. I know I gave a couple examples in the book from 1909. That was a big year because Mars is not positioned every 2 years, meaning it's at its closest point to Earth in its orbit, which is about at that time was about 35 million miles away. I don't think every 2 years it's quite the same, but that year was especially close. And so there was a lot of belief that if we could contact Martians or receive their messages, this would be the time to do it. So, for example, I mentioned William Henry Pickering at Harvard. He suggested having an array of giant mirrors set up, like a giant grid of massive mirrors. And each of those would then be reflecting light towards Mars. And he thought that if Mars had Martian scientists and astronomers, they would see our signals and they could eventually find a way to send us a signal back, which might take some time. This was going to cost, I think, $10 million, which was a lot more money, obviously, back in 1909.
Right.
That was one way. Another way I love is another professor who's at Amherst. His name was David Todd. He wanted to create a hot air balloon that he could ascend 50,000 feet in, and that he thought that was higher than any hot air balloon had gone at that time, and he thought that would get him away from all the interference, so he could easily receive messages coming from Mars. He thought that the Martians must think we were all stupid for not receiving their messages to this point. There's a great quote from him in there that's to that effect.
Hmm.
And so he was working on that. Obviously, that never happened in 1909. He never got that hot air balloon off the ground, but he tried it again in 1920. And he almost got there, but then the government, he was working with the government to actually build this thing and have a pilot. There was like a chief balloon pilot with the government or something like that. It's some crazy title. But it fell through at the last minute.
There was also a case, I think, in a desert where they were going to dig trenches and then light it on fire.
Yes, that was an
Mhm.
idea from the mid 1800s. There was there were two scientists. There was an Austrian scientist who wanted to dig trenches about, I think they were about 10 miles wide. I mean, it was a huge, it basically wanted to
Wow.
create a geometric shape. So if
Okay.
we had like a giant circle, for example, that could be dug into trenches in the desert and then fill it with kerosene and light it on fire, the Martians would see this giant flaming circle on Earth. And again, trying to speak a universal language of geometry, but they might also wonder what we're doing setting a big circle on fire. So who knows what they would have thought of us if they saw it. But yeah, that was his idea, was trying to find this universal language of mathematics in a way.
Interesting, since there are some structures on Mars that are very geometric. So
Yeah, I mean,
perhaps
I guess
they're,
we're kind of doing the same in a lot of ways. We see
yeah.
things and we assume that it's artificially created.
Yeah, and if they were there, perhaps they're long gone.
Yes.
Who knows? So how did what was the first thing that happened in the modern era to get people's interest in UFOs?
Well, the modern era, I would say, it goes back to the 40s. Certainly 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's
Mhm.
sighting, which was covered by newspapers across the country. That's where the term flying saucer came from. He mentioned it looked like saucers skipping, and reporter termed it flying saucers, and here we are still using the term today. But what's interesting is immediately following that, there were just thousands of reports across the country of seeing these kinds of flying saucers. So I reference a few of those in the book. And then, of course, that followed shortly after by Roswell, um,
Mhm.
which is interesting because Roswell was a bit of a blip of a news story at that point. It was a few days. Obviously, the famous headline about being a flying saucer recovered in Roswell, or flying disc, as the headline says. And then the next day, it's a weather balloon. But the story kind of fades away in terms of the media, and even books from that era barely touch it. It wasn't until about 30 years later when Stanton Friedman really revived the whole story and started interviewing people and digging up more information. But that, I would say, like, not to say that there weren't sightings before that. Of course, there was other things happening earlier in the 40s too, where people were seeing things, especially the Foo Fighters in World War II and so forth. So a
Right.
lot of stuff going on, but Kenneth Arnold is certainly a nice line for starting the modern era.
Yeah, and of course we had the 1941 crash in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, which is well documented, but it's just not that well known. We need to get that out there more, I think.
Yeah.
Now, you were good friends with our good friend Lee Spiegel,
Yes.
who was involved here at the NX Network, and you tell his story in your book, and there's a picture in there. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Lee Spiegel was a huge help with this book. We met years ago when we were both writing for AOL Weird News. And so Lee was, hugely supportive. He introduced me to a lot of people in the UFO community that were wonderful to speak with, and all very helpful. Also, researching, writing this book, lots of quotes from different people. And of course, in addition to Lee sharing his own thoughts and perspectives on the UFO phenomena, he shared his own story with me. And when I was at um, David Marler's archive, he's got an amazing UFO archive just outside of Albuquerque. I got to see Lee's actual files, the actual report he typed up from Lumberton, North Carolina in the 1970s when he saw that triangular UFO,
Oh,
which he
yeah.
always calls the Flying Dorito. But I
Mhm.
love telling Lee's story because not only is it's a great story where he was sent by J. Allen Hynek to go investigate this triangular shaped UFO in North Carolina. And he goes down there and he meets with the police chief, and they go following reports. And eventually they actually see this thing. They pull it to the side of the road. So they're together. There's a few other people with them. And they see this triangular UFO about treetop level high. Uh, and it's perfectly silent. It's just sitting there. It's, flashing lights at Lee's feet, basically. And there's no explanation for it. And then it zips off quietly. And they chase it down, but they can't keep up with it. And it's seen by other people as well. And Lee investigates the whole situation. He checks in with the local Air Force base. Are you testing certain equipment? Were there pilots testing another sort of vehicle in this area at this time? And nothing lined up. And so he types up this whole report. And really, it's one of these stories where there's never been an explanation. And Lee would talk about the fact that he, years after the fact, he would still try to get explanations from people or talk to people who were known skeptics and say, well, can you explain my story? And they couldn't. So I love the fact that, one, it's one of these unique stories that has no good explanation that's ever come forth. And also it's a situation where I know Lee, so I'm hearing it firsthand. I'm hearing it from someone who witnessed this thing firsthand, who actually know. And Lee is so genuine about it. And knowing Lee, I can't imagine he would just make something up, that doesn't make sense to me. Um, and again, he wasn't alone seeing this thing. So I love that uniqueness of the story.
Oh, indeed. And for somebody who had not had an encounter prior to that,
Right.
That was up close and personal. That's not
Yeah.
usually how it is. It's usually lights in the sky. It's something you're looking at that you realize that's not from Earth, but the up close personal stuff, that's kind of rare. So
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
amazing that he was able to see that. Uh, how far back in history do we have any evidence of UFOs?
Well, that's a tough question because what exactly is evidence, right? I mean, that's debated all the time.
Hmm.
Um, if it wasn't, then there wouldn't be much question, I suppose. But it just depends on how you want to look at it. I mean, certainly there's people that go all the way back to the Bible and say that there's evidence of UFOs in the Bible, but that also depends on what lens you look at it through and what context you look at it in. You know, I wrote briefly about Ezekiel's vision where he sees this chariot with the wheels and creatures that have these animal-like faces, and certainly that sounds like an odd description that could just as easily be a flying saucer as it is a chariot from heaven with God on it, right? Like, is
Hmm.
one really weirder than the other? Not really. But there's different explanations for that too, in terms of what Ezekiel may have been, what his times were like, the words he would have used to describe things. So again, are we looking at it with the right lens when we say it's a UFO or not? That's up for debate. So I think there's a lot of situations like that you can go back in early history and say, like, that looks like a UFO or some sort of alien type of thing, creature. But again, it really depends, I think, on the context of the culture that created it, whether there may be other meanings for what they created and what we're looking back at now. So there's that. And I cover a bunch of those stories in the book. And then I think you get back to the modern era, and then it just depends on what you believe. If you believe that materials recovered from Roswell are evidence, then there's that. Certainly now I think it's interesting what we have with, like, the Tic Tac video. To me, is fascinating. Still really no
Yeah.
explanation for that. To me, that's pretty strong evidence because, one, it's current. I wish there was more of it because it's very fleeting. But at least it's current, and I think that the people who witnessed it are, I believe, to be very credible. And so to me, that makes it stronger evidence than something that goes back 75 years that you're relying on lots of hearsay for.
Yeah, indeed. And it's nice to be able to talk directly to witnesses who are extremely credible.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they have more videos just like that. They just haven't released it
Yes.
to us yet.
That's what I hear, and it's like,
That would be.
when can we see it?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, in fact, we had, well, I did not see this, but we had XCon the last few days, and uh, I think it was Tuesday night or Monday night. We had a Skywatch planned, but it was really cold outside, so nobody went. But a couple of people did, and one of them happened to be a filmmaker, and he had his cell phone and he sees something weird and he decides to start filming it. Turns out it was a UFO, and it projected this energy or something in front of it. It was just this visible, whatever it is, we don't know. And then so that's in Springfield, Missouri. Less than an hour later, a very similar object that projected some type of energy was also videotaped at another place in Missouri. So
Wow.
this stuff is going on all the time. And every state, I'm involved with MUFON, and every state and every country that's involved in MUFON, there's constant activity, and it seems to be stepping up. In your interviews and in your research with this, have you noticed anything similar? Would you say that the sightings are increasing or not?
I think that one reason sightings would be increasing is because the stigma has gone away in large part.
Mhm.
So if you go back 6 years since that New York Times article in December 2017, when they talked about this hidden Pentagon program and the Tic Tac video was released, it seems that people are feeling much more comfortable talking about this subject and not being worried about being labeled a certain way for talking about. So I think there's been more openness, which is probably making people more comfortable to report sightings. But also pilots, especially, are are being encouraged now to report things, whereas before they, you hear stories of them not wanting to talk about it because they feared for their own jobs, that kind of thing. So I think removing the stigma is opening up the conversation much, much broader, and therefore you're going to get more sightings, and that offers more to study, and then we can learn more. So it's, that's all good things come from that.
Exactly. What would you say well, I'll tell you what, I do want to ask about the Foo Fighters, because there are still a lot of people who don't know about that. That was during World War II. What happened?
Yeah, so long before the band. This was, pilots, fighting in World War II against the Germans, and they're seeing these glowing objects kind of zipping right by their planes, or maneuvering, outmaneuvering their planes. Again, kind of like, look like sort of like a fireball kind of flying through the sky, and there's no explanation for it. At first, there were a lot of pilots thought that this was some kind of new German technology or something that was being shot at them, that they thought, the Germans had developed, and they were concerned about that. But that was never the case. In fact, later German pilots acknowledged also seeing these kinds of things as they were, battling in the skies. So there's no real explanation. I mean, I think there's some thought that maybe these were called, fireballs, a meteorological effect that was going on. But again, it's one of these odd things. Before there was a term like UFO or flying saucer, people just saw these unusual things in the sky, and they got termed Foo Fighters.
Yeah, I think they were seen in other countries too. Weren't they also seen in Sweden or somewhere near
Yes, I
there?
believe that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. What about some of the nuclear sites that went down? Have all of them gone down at some point and had a UFO hovering above them?
Yeah, so the nuclear sites is actually a really fascinating story. So at the beginning, I'm going to just back up for a second. So early on, when I first started this book, I went down to Washington, D.C. to the National Press Club, where Robert Salas was giving a conference with 3 other retired Air Force captains about their experiences in the 1960s of UFOs hovering over nuclear sites, and then, the missiles being taken offline, basically. And so, so Robert had seen there was a UFO spotted above the site at Malmstrom in Montana, and he was then working underground. So he went underground for his shift, and basically there were 10 ICBMs that were taken offline at this, like, all together. And he points out the fact that, one might think like some kind of glitch happened that shut them down, but he points out that each of these is interdependent of the other. So they're not connected. Like, one switch wouldn't turn off all 10. You'd have to have 10 glitches happening simultaneously for all 10 to go off at the same time, which just sounds like, that never happens once. How's it going to happen 10 times? And so that was very unusual. And it had happened just a week or 10 days earlier. 10 other ones had gone down also at a nearby site. So this was happening. And again, they were told not to talk about this. They all spoke about the fact that they were told to keep it quiet. And finally, here they are in their late 70s, early 80s, I believe all of them, finally just happy to be able to share their stories finally without fear of repercussions for it. But it's a fascinating case. It was actually, the Malmstrom case was brought up at the congressional hearings, I think May of last year, when the congressman asked about it, and the 2 guys from the UAP task force didn't even know what it was, and they were requested to go dig into it and find out about it, so we can maybe learn more about what was seen there and what actually happened there. But it's an interesting story, because what I also love about that that series of cases, and by the way, just to add to that, this was also happening in Russia. Like, it wasn't just in the States. There were other cases of UFOs over nuclear sites that were shutting things down or causing something to happen that's obviously concerning in one way or another.
Right.
But there was a lot of thought in the late 40s and early 50s that UFOs were coming because there was concern about the atomic age and the development of nuclear weapons, obviously after World War II, and that they were trying to warn us and stop this from spreading. So it's interesting to hear these stories from the 60s, almost like they're showing that, hey, we have some control and we're not going to let this happen, which in some ways might offer a little bit of comfort, that maybe they're here to help.
All right. Well, we are up on a break, and we'll be back in just a few minutes with more with Marc Hartzman. Are you thinking about purchasing a wood-fired heating or cooking appliance but don't know where to start? The new book, Wood-Fired Heating and Cooking, will guide you through the process and make the decision much easier. Find out about wood stoves, wood-burning fireplace inserts, masonry heaters, cook stoves, brick ovens, and more. Learn about operation and maintenance, buying and storing wood, even how to make your own charcoal. A bonus section includes delicious recipes for cooking in a wood-burning oven, grill, tandoori oven, or smoker. The wise homeowner, prepper, or homesteader will have the ability to heat their home with wood when the power goes out or to save money on increasing gas bills. Wood-fired heating and cooking is available at Amazon. Visit www.woodfiredpub.com for more information. That's woodfiredpub.com. And we are back with NX News. I'm your host, Margie K. Thank you for joining me this evening. My special guest tonight is Marc Hartzman. Marc, let me ask you a couple of questions. Some things I found on your website that are pretty interesting that don't have anything to do with the book, and then we'll get back to that. You said you once interviewed Vanilla Ice on his tour bus, and he yammered on about aliens for quite a while. What was that all about?
That's right, he did. That was a long time ago. That must have been, gosh, around 1999 or something like that. Yeah, so a good friend of mine was managing Vanilla Ice at the time, and he was sort of doing the comeback type of tour in New York City, and he was outside of a concert venue called Tramps, which is now gone, sadly. But he had his tour bus out front. So my friend got me to go on, and I was publishing a zine at that time called Backwash. And it was just kind of writing about stuff I was interested in and, reviewing music, that kind of thing. And so I got to interview Vanilla Ice, and we talked for probably like an hour on the bus. He was very talkative, talked about aliens and believed that aliens are how we all got here, that aliens came to this earth and, populated it, shared all of his theories with me. And he was going on so long, my friend finally had to come on the bus and say, "Hey, you got to go. Like, you got to get on stage." So that's, that got cut short because, at a concert together, people were paying to come see.
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess so. Well, I like his show that he does, that rehab show that he does. He's pretty cool.
He was a nice guy.
Did he mention that he had ever seen a UFO or just had an interest in it?
I think he just had an interest in it. He had a big interest in it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you also interviewed the chief engineer of the Solar System Exploration Directorate at NASA. Did you learn anything interesting during that interview?
Oh yeah. So that was for my book, The Big Book of Mars, and it was great talking to him. I mean, this I thought that title was the coolest title I've ever heard of anyone having. um, so he his name is Gentry Lee, by the way. So he's a brilliant guy who's NASA JPL, where it's where the Mars rovers are all being put together and everything, and
Mm-hmm.
he had worked on the Viking mission, so he shared a lot of those experiences. And one thing specifically I really loved that he told me about was the fact that the Viking mission, which was in the 1970s, those were the first two landers on Mars, that they found life on Mars. They had each of them had a test on it. They had multiple tests to detect for life on Mars. And one of those tests on each of the landers came back with positive results. And he directed me to the guy who actually ran that experiment, actually the two co-experimenters. So I spoke with both of them, and they stood by their data. Their data was positive. They saw no reason why it shouldn't be believed, but NASA at the time believed it may have been an exotic biological reaction exotic chemical reaction as opposed to a biological reaction. But the data never was disproved. They never could actually prove it was chemical versus biological. So years later, he finally felt freed up to speak about this and wrote many papers about his data. But this was something that was really just known within the scientific community. I'd never heard that life was found on Mars in the 70s. I don't think the mass public really knew that. So I was thrilled to be able to share that story in the Big Book of Mars and explain what happened and why they believe that their data holds true.
Interesting. Well, you've been around. I'm looking at your website. You've done just about everything, including a contestant on Wheel of Fortune, which is one of my favorite shows. When were you on the show?
I was on in September of 2019, which was such an amazing experience to have. Not something I ever expected I would do, but my kids had really pushed me to try out for it a few years earlier. It was a long process till I actually made it on the show, just because of scheduling and so forth. But I eventually made it on, and it's one of those things. I got there that morning. I think they filmed 6 shows that day, and I was the 5th show. And I just had no idea what to expect. Like, I don't know what's going to happen today, But I had really good luck. I did really well. I had amazing luck with the wheel. No lose a turn, no bankrupt.
Wow.
Had big money, and I won. I got to the bonus land at the end of the show. I won a lot of money. I won a trip to Costa Rica, which was incredible. Pat and Vanna are incredibly nice, and they put you at ease right away. Everyone from that show they were all so wonderful to deal with. I was just absolutely amazed at how good they were just running that show and keeping everybody comfortable and working through everything, especially with the trip. I had to postpone it because of COVID, and everything was just incredibly smooth. So they run a good show there. Obviously, that's why it's been on for so long.
Yeah, really. And they do really seem like nice people. So that's good to know that they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, no, it's always nice when the people that seem nice actually are. It's good.
Really.
Always feels better.
Yeah. That was a heck of an experience for you. I noticed one other thing I wanted to mention. Your wife and children are related to Mark Twain. So that is cool.
Yeah.
So they follow your wife's line back. How are you related, or how are they related?
It goes through my wife's her father's side of the family. Where there's Clemens in there. I forgot the exact roots, but it's somewhere. I think my father-in-law's grandparents. I think there's like a sibling in there that was Clemens. So it's somewhere back there. But yeah, there's that relation. So it's kind of a neat thing.
Okay, let's get back to the book now. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You have some close encounters that you talk about. What are some of the more interesting close encounters you discovered?
Close encounters, do you mean in terms of like
Eh,
sightings or in terms of meeting people?
Contactees or
Contact.
abductees. Yeah, let's
Yeah.
go.
So
Let's go there.
yeah. Okay. So, it's a broad term, but
Yeah.
there there's quite a range I cover in the book. You mentioned contactees, and those were this group in the 1950s that claimed to have met oftentimes Venusians. I kind of,
Yes.
having written about Mars, I thought it was interesting that there was so much about Venus. Typically don't hear much about Venus just in the role of sci-fi, right? It's always Martians.
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, the 50s, the Venusians were quite popular. They were always beautiful people. They looked like humanoids, but better than, looked better than us was how they were described. George Adamski was a big one, and he also met
Mhm.
a Martian and a Saturnarian, and flew on their spaceships, and he shared those stories. And I've got the books behind me here, which I love. Those book titles, Inside the Spaceships, is great. So I love the stories that they tell. There's so many of them. There were so many interesting characters that were doing this and holding lectures, around the country and writing their books. And Howard Menger was one of these contactees who married a Venusian woman who even made a record album of music from space, from another planet. So all
Mhm.
these interesting characters, but like I mentioned earlier, generally their message was one of peace and being careful on this earth and protecting it and not blowing ourselves up or destroying the rest of the solar system or other planets as it may be. So while it was definitely kind of quirky, their message I think was a good one. And then you get into the abductees later, and there's a lot of fascinating stories there. Um, I spoke with Peter Robbins, who's wonderful and obviously has a show here, and the experience he had as a teenager and his sister. So I share their experience, which is pretty fascinating. His sister was abducted by a UFO in the 60s, just before the Betty and Barney Hill story, which I thought was really interesting because that's usually the one everyone thinks of as the first
Mhm.
abduction story, which
Right.
in terms of being out there in the public, yes, but Peters preceded that, which I thought was interesting. And then one story I really love in terms of very close encounter. So there's the encounters we talked about, right? So meeting them, flying on spaceships, and then being abducted. And then there's the hybrid stories. So when I was at the MUFON um, symposium last year in Colorado, that was just before I was finishing up the book. So it was great to meet more people and get more stories for the book. But I met a woman, Kim Carlsberg, who was a camera woman for Baywatch. And she told me a lot of stories. She had a lot of experiences, claimed to have been abducted many, many times. And like it was just a regular thing. And she had hybrid children. She met one of them who came to her home. So she described that, which I tell that full story in the book. One thing I especially love about her story, because you'll hear a lot of stories of people who claim to have had hybrid children through aliens. Um, but I love that hers actually kind of got embedded in the pop culture because she was working on Baywatch. And so the whole
Mhm.
staff knew of her adventures. So David Hasselhoff would ride up to her on the beach and ask her about her abduction. This was like a thing they would talk about. So she told me how one day she was late for work and the producer came running to her and said, "Come on, Kim, you got to get down to the beach and see what we have set up for you." And she saw all these radio telescopes set up on the beach, and they were filming an episode about a UFO sighting and abduction, in the Baywatch scene, Baywatch Beach. So
Oh,
her stories became an episode of Baywatch. So I love that, like, she made a ding in pop culture, regardless of what you want to think of her stories. Um, it's part of Baywatch now. It's part of an episode.
yeah.
So I kind of
Yeah.
love that.
Kim's a good friend of mine, and she's very credible.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I love she
She's
was great. She talked to me for 45 minutes off on the side while the symposium was going on. So it was great to get her stories.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's good that we have so many people now, right now, who are alive right now to talk about their close encounters and their abductions. Um, but let's go back a little bit. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 5-star general, 34th president of the United States, alien contactee? Was he?
I mean, again, this is one of those questions that a lot of people believe that's the case. I don't know that that's certainly you can't prove it. I think one way or the other, but it's a pretty fascinating case to look at. This sort of mysterious disappearance while he was on vacation in Palm Springs, and of course, people think at that point he was meeting with different aliens, discussing potential acquisition of knowledge in exchange for access to Earth, right? Basically.
Mhm.
So who knows? I mean, people believe that we got that knowledge, and that's how sort of technology has flourished so much in the past few decades. Of course, that's not proven, but it definitely makes for interesting theories and certainly some fun stories to share and debate. So again, that's what I love about this book, is just sharing all these stories and leaving it up for discussion. I can't, like I said, you can't prove one way or the other, but it definitely makes for good conversation and thought.
Yeah, and you do put a lot of the drawings that people made in the book of what they saw, and you don't always see that. So that makes it much more interesting to look at, and it also makes it more believable when somebody makes a drawing, and especially if you have several people who are witnesses, and a lot of times what I do is I put them in different rooms with a piece of paper and a pencil, and I'll say, draw what you saw, and then we'll bring everybody back together and compare. And
Yeah.
when it's when it's similar or exact, that's pretty good evidence that they all saw the same thing.
Yeah. Here's a couple. Just this is
Yeah.
from the aerial. I'm blocking a little bit. The aerial school incident in Zimbabwe, and you see those drawings that the kids made.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I love that story, because here's just a bunch of school children that probably don't know anything about UFOs. Maybe never even heard the term,
Hmm.
and they're all separate. And like you said, they're drawing pictures that obviously that's only two, but there were, I believe, nearly 100 that saw this thing. So
Yeah.
if I remember my stats right, but they're drawing basically the same thing and sharing these same kinds of observations. Again, these mass witness cases I find especially intriguing.
Well, I will just pop up some of these photos that you sent me, and if you would just talk about those briefly.
Yeah, so this is showing at the bottom there's the James Webb telescope, rendering of that, and then you're seeing just radio telescopes from SETI. So there's this section here. This is a section that's purely based on like what scientists have been doing, their efforts to find extraterrestrial life. So that's where I got into some of those early stories we talked about, from trying to contact Martians. The chapter begins with those different kinds of stories, but goes up to the like the Drake equation, which was from 1961, where Frank Drake was trying to figure out with other scientists how many intelligent civilizations might exist within the galaxy.
Hmm.
And so a lot of serious thought about extraterrestrial life, and eventually that developed into the SETI program, again searching for it with radio telescopes. And then James Webb is fascinating, because that's got the potential to detect biosignatures in the atmospheres of exoplanets. And so we can start to see from that if there's actually something alive on an exoplanet. Of course, we even know about exoplanets in the 60s. Now we're finding them, frequently now. I believe they
Hmm.
found over 5,000. So you find the ones that could be in a habitable zone. You can get evidence of a biosignature, and you could know that there's something alive there. Of course, we don't know if that's intelligent or what it might be, but it's getting a step closer. I also talked about technosignatures in the book, and James Webb, along with its successor, which will launch probably in, I believe, the 2030s, that will be able to start to detect more in atmospheres and start to understand if certain gases are being created by technology on the planet. And if it's technology, then it's intelligently created. So again, it starts to give us new ways to find out if there's real evidence for intelligent life out there.
Wow, that's I'm glad somebody thought of that. Let's
Yeah,
put it
no,
that way.
it's
They
cool.
thought of something new. Yeah.
It's amazing that these scientists are working on that and figuring out
Yeah.
how to find evidence with the technology that we have and are working on to actually get
Mhm.
real data that we can then actually know something for sure, which I love.
Okay. What
So
about
this,
this?
I mentioned Howard Menger earlier. I love this. The image at the top there is a lecture card, and I got this from from the archive, David Marler's house outside Albuquerque. And I was going through a lot of his books. He's got an amazing book collection of contactees, and one of them right there below is They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. And you see the Men in Black. This is where Men in Black, actually, that term came from. But I kept pulling books off of his shelf and moving these little, basically like note cards out of the way because they were blocking some books. And finally, I said, "What are these cards? They just keep moving out of the way." And they were all these postcards from different contactees inviting their followers to come to their lectures. So I love showing that. I love all the different ephemera. Again, just showing these physical objects that this was what was
Yeah.
going on. This was what people were believing and how they were sharing information. So it's I love just kind of taking it from his archive and being able to share that with the public in this book.
Mm-hmm.
This is another one of my favorite cases, the Phoenix Lights. I mentioned earlier the idea of mass witnesses and how compelling that is. The Phoenix Lights is such a great example from 1997. So I love this headline here. What you're seeing there is an image of the governor at the podium when he's talking about these triangular, UFOs that some 20,000 people saw in Phoenix, just passing overhead, again, silent, like what Lee Spiegel had described, and seeing that it's a solid object that's enormous, and having no explanation for it. And the governor kind of made light of it initially. And you can see he's calling in one of his aides who's dressed as an alien. It's maybe a little hard to tell in that image, but he's got a big alien mask on and the silver suit, and gloves and everything. So kind of making a mockery of it, which people didn't really appreciate because they truly believe they saw something. That governor later came out and admitted that he saw it too. And he also has no explanation for it. And I think to this day, I think he still contends he doesn't know what it was. And there's been no explanation of that one either, which keeps you wondering.
Oh, yeah. There were so many witnesses across the state.
Yeah. Yeah, not just Phoenix. Yeah.
No, yeah, it traveled across the whole state. And what was interesting was the media tried to cover it up. The government tried to cover it up. The military tried to say it was flares.
Right.
And you just any rational thinking person looking at that would know they're not flares.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
they're staying in the same
flares.
place.
I understand how a flare would descend from the sky, and this was not that.
No, that was not that at all.
Yeah.
And there have been some other really big sightings that have not gotten the media coverage. For instance, in 2011, we had a huge UFO sighting in Kansas City, and we had more reports of UFO sightings than anywhere in the world at that time. And nobody knows about that. It's just that the media just does not pick up some of these things. So there's a lot more going on than meets the eye, than people are aware of.
Yeah.
When you were researching the book, did you find new information you didn't know about before?
Oh, I mean, for me, certainly there was lots of information that I didn't know, and I love digging up, and obviously, I tried to share like some of the more known cases, like Roswell, of course, and Kenneth Arnold, but also digging into some of these lesser known ones, especially from that early period. We talked about triangular UFOs, and you think about that with Lee's story and with Phoenix Lights, like we just said, but I had reports back, I would dig up from the early 1950s of pilots also seeing triangular UFOs. So you see some of these things, you think of flying saucers always as a disc, but you start finding these old obscure stories tucked away in old case files or newspaper clippings about different types of stories. One of them I talked about at the beginning of the book. This is, I think, a good answer to your question, actually. I met a guy in Roswell when I went up there who had an experience in New Mexico, in Hobbs, New Mexico, who was living in Roswell now, but he was 8 years old. This was 1964. And he had this top-shaped UFO that he was watching from across the parking lot of his grandmother's laundromat, just playing outside. And again, it was like treetop level high. And it's kind of mimicking his movements back and forth like this. And finally, it shoots over his head and belches flames over his head. I never heard any kind of story like this before. And he had burns from his chin up, and he was taken to the hospital, rushed there, had a burn specialist treat him right away. He recovered eventually, but the FBI investigated this case, found no cause for any of it. Like, there's no evidence left that would explain anything that had happened to him. And this, there was like a few brief articles in the local newspapers about this. But then what's so fascinating, I talked about this in the introduction, beyond that, this was something that I learned from Dave Marler's research. there were other cases like this around the country around the same time, of top-shaped UFOs just belching fire on people, which is like, that
That's
was one that
crazy.
I'd never come across or heard before,
I
and you don't hear
I
about.
haven't either.
Yeah,
I
so
have not either, and I've been
there's
doing this a long time. So
yeah,
this
th
was a new one. When I read that, I was whoa. And there, you know what is also odd, and you may have found this in your research, um, where you have these clusters of you like the top UFO, and then they're gone, and then there's
yeah,
some other strange shape. We had very, very elongated tubes with square windows in them in April a couple of years ago in Missouri, all across Missouri and Kansas, and some in Oklahoma. And then there was nothing before that and nothing since. It's just weird. What do you think
yeah.
that is? You think they're different species from different planets or different dimensions? Or,
That's well, I mean, hey,
Mhm.
those are all possibilities, right? That's it's interesting when we talk about like what is this phenomenon, and who's to say it's one, right? Like who's to say that everything that people have witnessed over decades or millennia, if you will, who's to say it's one thing happening? Maybe it's a little bit of all the above. Maybe it is different species visiting in some way. Maybe it is another dimension. We don't know. But the fact that we don't know is what just keeps this interesting, and the pursuit of trying to find out what these things are, I think, keeps us all engaged, and
Mhm.
trying to learn more about it. And what I love now is that, earlier we talked about sort of how the stigma has gone away, and I talked to Avi Loeb when I was writing this book, and so I talked about his work now, the Galileo Project. And what I think is so great is that someone like him, with his credentials and his knowledge and everything he has access to, he's searching for more data to figure out, like, are other things coming through our solar system, that other interstellar objects that we're missing before, we were not studying properly. Can we find out what those things are? Is it, as he calls it, like remnants of alien architecture, floating through, or not remnants, current, who knows? But he's attracted, more than 100 scientists to help him collect this data, because now they feel more comfortable looking for it. So again, you have
Mhm.
all this scientific thought now focusing on it, which is something you didn't have decades ago, because
Right.
that stigma was there. It makes you wonder, hey, if they weren't concerned about studying this subject openly and actually collecting data, where would we be now? How much more would we know? We may be much further
Yeah.
along. We've kind of hindered ourselves in terms of knowledge.
Well, now that that's all changed, perhaps more mainstream scientists will get involved in it.
Yeah.
That would be good if they would. We've got the contents here, which, well, I can't see. I can't read it, but um,
Yeah.
I will.
I love the design of this, but also just nice to kind of show the breakdown of the book. So
Yeah.
it starts with the attack of the flying saucers, which kind of dives into the 1940s and close encounters that we talked about. The phenomena continues, kind of takes us through the decades, getting closer to now. And then the scientific efforts with the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and then the truth is out there officially, which really gets into the stories going on now, with the government admitting the fact that it doesn't know what's flying over, in our airspace, the UAPs. That, to me, that's an amazing admission to say, no, we don't know what these things are. It's in our airspace and we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, I spoke with Christopher Mellon, and he's so great with how he's been pushing for the study of all this, because it's really a matter of national defense. How can we not know what's flying overhead? Like, that's a problem. If it's foreign
Hmm.
technology, that's a problem that we don't know what it is. If it's alien technology, we better, understand it before we're surprised by it in a negative way. So when they look, I think
Yeah.
when the government looks at with that lens, it's much easier for them to talk about and study and investigate further. So yeah, like I said, it's a pretty amazing admission to say, yeah, we actually don't know.
It sure is. Your book is available where?
It's anywhere you buy books. It should be in any local bookstore, Barnes and Noble, local independent bookstores, and then of course on Amazon, bookshop.org. Any place you buy online, you can find the book.
Okay. Thank you so much, Marc, for coming on. I appreciate it. The book is fascinating. I can't wait to finish reading it on my end. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Margie. I appreciate you having me on.
All right. Thank you to Marc Hartzman. This is Margie K with The Next News, and I'll see you here again next week.